does only apply to changes that require migrations, but those are, it still happens fairly regularly.
That's still common. The last time I looked through like stuff that's going through into it for Pulp 3. But it sounds like one of the bigger problems is that your stakeholders and you are not aligned on the evolutionary strategy for Pulp. Like how they're going to be consumed and how they're going to be used and how they're going to be shipped. And that is problematic and is probably like the underlying source of this whole question of how are we going to handle releases, is that you can't get your stakeholders and yourself together to align on how this should be evolving. I think getting an answer to that question first is going to be required before we can figure out any details for the rest of it. Because until you get the satellite team on board with whatever you want to do, I don't know how you're going to do anything. Like, I'm speaking as someone who just wants to use Pulp, like the way you guys develop is kind of hard for me to keep track of everything. And like, I don't know if I can trust releases to work because I can't follow them linearly in a relatively sane way. But at the same time, you have this complexity where the satellite team is not taking your releases as soon as you're making them and essentially pushing them forward. So I don't know what you can do here, but I think what you're going to have to do is figure out what the satellite team wants from you and align that to what the Pulp team wants to move forward on.
And the fun thing is we actually have multiple stakeholders. I mean, satellites and Catello are the ones everybody knows about because they're very public. There's a number of products and projects that rely on Pulp that aren't the satellite team, aren't the Catello team, and they have their own ideas for how often they can upgrade and how important various things are. So one of the comments that we hear regularly in just talking to each other and banging our heads on our tubes is how to meet all of these often incompatible, conflicting requirements from our multiple stakeholders. My observation over the last year is we do as well at that as I've seen a project do, but it's definitely something that doesn't mean we're doing it well. It just means not completely imploding over the requirements.
So the concern that Daniel brings up, I think, is a very serious one. With the migrations, and I think it is worth exploring more, because it doesn't matter what strategy we pick for our branching if we can't figure out how to deal with migrations. All of this will be moot.
So on the migrations point, I had imagined, regardless of how the branching is done, I'd imagine that the 3 line will continue to receive migrations, and the 4 line would be in development as master and would receive a new and different migrations, and the set of migrations from 3 would be applied all of them, and then when you go to upgrade to 4, which is a one-way event, the first migration for migration 4 would be the first one run after the last migration of 3, and it would iterate forward through all of them.
So, I mean, during the development of Pulp 4, that's fine. We can keep rebasing the migrations in Pulp 4 to like keep it updated. But once we release Pulp 4 and it actually gets installed and a user upgrades to it, then those migrations are now frozen.
I agree.
Can't make change.
I agree.
And this is the motivation to upgrade to 4.
Yeah, what I hear is that a bug fix must not contain a migration.
And that's going to be, well, hopefully that will get easier as we find the major problems. We have had bug fixes recently where the fix is, oh shit, that has to be unique, for example. Again, he says, hoping with all of his fingers crossed that that is less often, but I guarantee you it's going to happen occasionally. It's really difficult to say that as an overarching thing because we all know how software works.
Yeah, and so in Pulp 2, in order to deal with the Catello, Pulp that's in Catello and stuff, is we would renumber migrations sometimes. And that's right. We, I think, want to avoid getting into a situation where we do that between, Pulp 4 and Pulp 3.
Definitely, it's a difficult problem. The lack of idempotency makes it harder, but even once you make them idempotent, you still have an ordering issue, and I don't know how to solve both of them yet.
Yep.
Generally, migrations come with dependencies.
Yeah, there are.
Exactly, and you can't skip them is the thing.
I believe you can.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing this right, I think that what we've established is that we know how to safely develop Pulp 4 with regards to migrations, and we do not know how safely to release Pulp 4 while continuing to release older versions of Pulp 3. And so for what I was hoping for from the session, that actually checks my box pretty well, because I think we have time to figure out that second part more than we would need. Like, just because we can't figure it out right here in this meeting, like, we need to look at more details about the Django migration system and how it works and how other projects co-ship to mainlines. But I think that what I'm understanding is that we absolutely could call master Pulp 4, and if we did, we could continue creating new migrations for Pulp 3 and creating and rebasing migrations for Pulp 4, and it sounds like everything would be fine.
Yeah, the challenge is only after Pulp 4 is released.
I agree.
Or just before the act of releasing it and getting the mic. But yes, you're right. So if we decided right now that master is Pulp 4, we would need to clean up. We would need to have an appropriate 3 release branch for folk that are using that. Maybe not. I'm designing off the top of my head. My apologies. We might need to clean up what we have right now. Maybe not. But basically, we could say right now today, everything in master is heading for Pulp 4. And if next week we decide here's a thing that needs to happen next year because of stakeholders, or Robin comes and tells us, or whatever, and it's going to be incompatible, it needs to break the API, at that point we need to make sure that we have the machinery in place for people that are using 3 to be able to keep doing their thing. But we're now working on Pulp 4, and we start down this path. And then 9 months from now, when it's like, all right, now we're going to release Pulp 4, then hopefully we'll have solved the migration problem between now and then.
Yeah, so I think the branching problem, I think, is clear. And I feel like that part I'm satisfied with, and that's really what this session was meant to cover. So who's ready to start working on 4? Cool.
I think Matthias is changing the entire locking structure like next Tuesday, so he's probably the good candidate.
Well, yeah, and it's discussions like that that cause me to want to have a session like this.
But changing that might make to rebase migrations very hard.
Yep, and that's really where the That's where the collision is going to happen, and there's going to be blood and guts and gore and steel all over the road. I'm not sure how to avoid that. The fact that we're aware of it now instead of the Tuesday before release is good. So we can kind of keep it in mind, because I certainly do not have a solution for that. Okay. I'm throwing notes in here, by the way. If I've misstated anybody's case, please hit up the doc and change it, or hit me up. I will change things.
Cool. I'm going to stop recording at this time, unless we want to continue this discussion.
I mean, hell, we can continue this discussion forever. What else do we want to get out of this in terms of future of folk that weren't able to be here? Is the only question.
All right, on that note, I'm going to stop the recording.
Interesting. Neil, you certainly go ahead.
What is it, Grant?
I was just going to say I appreciate Neil dropping in and pulling the pins on a few hand grenades and then dropping them on the floor.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I'm here for.
No, seriously, no,
it's really great.
It really is. That's kind of amusing, but that's exactly the kind of input I was hoping to get from PulpCon, because those of us on the team, we talk to each other about this stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And which means the conversations can end up going in very well-worn ruts, and you don't even see that there's an entire highway over here. You could just step up and over to, and it'd be so much easier. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
We may hit you up for more input now that you've dropped in.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's fine. I mean, what is it? David, Ali, and I had already been talking for a while about Pulp stuff, and like one of the things that I've been wanting to do for a little while, and I kind of held off because David kept telling me Pulp's not ready for it, was I wanted to get Pulp actually into Fedora, packaged and available as something that we can, that people can actually just easily install and use. And this is also going to kind of be the basis of like how I'm going to do my deployment for Pulp, because I hate containers. is basically what it is. Containers are very, very easy to start with, but they are very, very hard to keep up with. And if I need to make bug fixes or patches or modifications, it's not straightforward to do in a container. It's extremely easy to do if I've got RPMs that I can work with. And so like most of our infrastructure deployments at Datto, since we're not recorded, woo, are based on either RPMs that are being deployed onto CentOS or OpenSUSE or Fedora machines, mostly CentOS and OpenSUSE, or they're RPMs that I have converted, the RPM spec files that I have adapted to build as Debian packages for Ubuntu, which is what most of our infrastructure runs on. So, and we use virtual machines and have those set up, and we have Puppet managed deployments and crap like that. But we use these machines this way because, as it turns out, infrastructure software is ridiculously hard to get right inside of containers. I think the Kubernetes people learned the hard way that Kubernetes does not work nicely running inside of a container. Managing itself is very hard. And that's true for a lot of infrastructure applications, especially Pulp, which actually requires RPM, libsolve, create repo C. Like it gets, and actually being able to update those makes massive improvements to Pulp itself. And so containers make this difficult rather than easy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I know, Mike. I know.
I think that,
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You and I are going to have to actually finish that someday because, like, it's basically a prerequisite for me deploying it.
I know. We should do a Connecticut or New York City Hackfest on this.
Yeah, well, one day when the pandemic is over.
Yeah. Or outdoors at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
So just briefly, Neil, going down that path of getting this into Fedora, one of the things we've been talking about, in fact, there's sessions in this PulpCon about a command line interface, where Pulp admin lives today, but hopefully something that's more maintainable, and a UI. And there's some interesting work happening on the UI front. So what are your thoughts of, let's say today we were ready, we had RPMs for Pulp. It has neither of those things. Do we push to get those into Fedora, or do we wait until it's more end user consumable, as opposed to I'm already an expert in this kind of thing and I'm willing to put up with having to do the REST API directly?
I think doing it now in Fedora is still valuable because it brings you some exposure. It makes it easier for people to work with. And then you start thinking about, well, Cockpit is primarily developed on Fedora. If your web front end is going to be built on Cockpit, which I think it will be because everybody else seems to be writing Cockpit modules. If it's not, then that's an interesting change. But like everybody else is writing Cockpit modules, so I expect that you will. 389DS changed to a Cockpit module, for example. And it's easy to do those kinds of developments when you have everything plugged in together into that target environment. Makes it easier to do CI. It makes it easier to plug all those, do gating and things like that. But it also gives exposure for people who want to integrate into their own system. So, for example, in my particular case, yes, a CLI would be very handy for being able to do manual pushes and shit like that. But also, I run an open build service instance, and one of the things that we've got a problem with our homegrown is that pulling things from OBS and pushing it into a repo for things to consume is not easy as it currently stands. I have to develop some kind of middleware to take an AMQP message from OBS and do actions on it, and then to transfer it to something else. Right now, our thing is we pull it via HTTP, then we SCP it to the package server, run a cron job, and it eventually imports. Well, your REST API means I can just take it from OBS and just shove it into Pulp more or less immediately, using the same flow with authentication and all those sorts of things. So as long as you've got an RBAC and you have a REST API, at least for that use case, I'm more or less satisfied. And you have a Python API, and I'm going to write my middleware in Python because I'm not stupid. So as long as you have those pieces, at least from my perspective, you're settled. It also gives an opportunity for other projects that operate primarily in Fedora to consider using Pulp. So, for example, the Copper project has their own thing for how they do repositories and stuff. If Pulp was in Fedora, then that can open up a conversation of how to make Pulp usable for the Copper use case. There's also the Cobbler project, which used to be a Fedora, it is technically still a Fedora project, but it's run by SUSE employees. They're considering using Pulp to replace their homegrown RPM repository repo sync backend. That conversation becomes much easier once Pulp is in Fedora, because then it becomes testable and usable, and you can target it. And the conversations keep going on and on. People write all kinds of tools and infrastructure and things like that. Like Daniel and I've had a conversation about at one point, maybe making Fedora do this for some of the other artifacts, or like maybe we want to have archive copies of stuff Bodhi pushes out. Like this keeps coming up, and oh, well, that's great. Fortunately, I didn't say anything too secret. This is, having these kinds of ways of having a workflow where immediately after a Bodhi push, we can actually archive that snapshot into Pulp. Means that we can also present a way for people to access historical versions of updates. We can do fancy things like, let's retrieve all the Delta RPMs from older snapshots and just republish them, and things like that. Like there's all kinds of interesting workflow possibilities that become things we can look at once Pulp is actually in Fedora.
It sounds like I need you to come to my talk tomorrow, which is on community use cases that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, honestly, Neil, if I could just if I could do a bunch of video calls with you, it would probably take me like a week to get those RPMs updated in Fedora,
Yeah, I mean, sure.
That's my
yeah,
estimate.
sure, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, like, my estimate was based on the fact that I would not have somebody that could honestly ask questions. They had to do lots of research. Like, how do I handle this warning? Do I need to get this test up?
Yeah,
But if I could ask you, it would just go a lot quicker. My prior estimates were based on.
There's more than me though. Like, you can ask anybody in the Fedora Python SIG because again, Pulp is thankfully all in Python.
Yeah.
A few other folks, but like, yeah, you can always hit me up and ask. I mean, you and I are in the same time zone. You know how you can reach me.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
So there used to be times when Pulp wasn't Fedora, and I'm not sure how much visibility and awareness we got. I don't know whether it was due to Pulp 2 or Mongo. But I think we retired.
The Mongo thing killed it hard for almost everybody. It was seriously the MongoDB thing, because MongoDB is a difficult, very difficult thing for people to deal with. And again, while it is kind of understood as a database, it's poorly understood. And most people don't have, like, the reason why MongoDB has such a bad reputation is because it's actually really difficult to scale and preserve performance. And that
Ironic.
makes it a very unappealing thing to use.
Yep. And I mean, to be fair, one of the problems that we've always had with Mongo specific to Pulp is a lot of what Pulp does wants to be transactional, and it wants to be ACID, and Mongo is a big hammer that's for driving a very differently shaped nail. And regardless of Mongo's capabilities in the arena where it's really good, it's not a great fit for the kind of things that Pulp wants to do. So anyway, I'm hopefully getting it back to something that is better understood will help with that use case.
Question about the packaging, Neil. So like the current plan for packaging as like RPMs is that whenever you would upgrade Pulp, you'd have to rerun the installer.
That's fine.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's perfectly fine. I mean, the way I typically handle this kind of thing, because I package Pagger for Fedora, is that I include I include an upgraders document that says, for this release, you need to run this command to do database migrations or whatever. Like, if the part that handles, I'm not even going to say this is mandatory, but like, it's nice if the tool that can actually do the database migrations and all the other fancy stuff can actually be included in the Pulp RPMs, Pulp RPM set. It doesn't have to be. If it's not in there, then at least documenting how to do the migrations is very helpful, because otherwise it gets difficult for people to continue using it.
Right. It's more than just the installer does more than just migrations. It'll write out new config settings, for example, or new permissions.
Sure. But it's Ansible based, right?
Yes, it's Ansible based. It's roles.
Just package the Ansible role. We already have macros and stuff for doing that. Yeah, we already have macros and stuff for doing it. Just include it and then add a wrapper that says, "Hey, run this command after you've done an upgrade, and it will handle all of the transitions for you."
Well, that's
pretty cool.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Neil, when you said copper, did you mean COPR?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'll change that in the notes then.
I got it. I don't know why I thought that was a separate. I was thinking, wow, that's a project I've never heard of. I got to go look that up, because I pronounce it Coper. So
I've heard copper mostly.
Whatever. Cool other package repos.
Exactly.
I know, it's great.
I threw a note in the chat, by the way. I've got a document that I started, which I just titled Interesting Notes, because I guarantee you we're going to have a lot of them. If you all look at that or at the document that we're in currently, and I missed anything or misstated, please just change it. Anybody signed into HackMD has right access to the docs.
Neil, I have a question. You were mentioning like different companies or projects which are considering using Pulp. Like this sort of feedback, where do you get it from? Because for example, I didn't hear anything about the Cobbler project.
I talk to people. I talk to everybody, basically.
Right, and what we're trying to do is basically motivate people to directly talk to us.
Yeah, well, nobody knows how to talk to you guys.
Okay, so what we can do better about this?
So there's two problems you guys have. One, your mailing lists are on redhat.com. Nobody can find them. There's actually no link anywhere on the Red Hat site to get to the mailing lists. I actually had the same conversation with Anaconda. I had the same conversation with the dog tag folks. They're both, dog tag is moving to the list.fedora hosted project list because it's discoverable, and Anaconda is looking at doing the same. So you might want to consider doing that, because like nobody can find your mailing lists. And the second thing is, you don't, as far as I know, have regular community meetings that people can just drop in or whatever. If you do, I don't know about them because I haven't been attending any of them.
Yeah,
I know that you have sprint reviews which show up on YouTube, but I don't know if you've got like a periodic thing where people can come by and like talk to you and give feedback and stuff, or even if there's a direct path to talk to you guys at all.
Yeah, so there is. We do bug triage, and now we follow it with open floor, and this is all done in our Pound Pulp meeting channel on IRC. I'm not. It's still probably hard to find out that that's possible. That information is on our website, but perhaps it could be more prominently displayed.
I think that couples with Neil's comment about nobody's on the mailing list because they're hard to find. And I assume, I will not speak for anybody else, I assume that when I throw an email out to the Pulp list, I am hitting everybody who might be interested in Pulp. However, it sounds like that's not true because nobody's on the mailing list because they can't find it. So there's a chicken and egg problem we have to break out of here, is how to get more people into the global list so that when we say things like, hey, we send out a weekly Pulp sprint review is going to be happening, whatever, that more people will have an opportunity to see it and be able to find it.
This is really interesting because we're trying to improve our docs whenever we see some room for improvement. And I think we always mention like a way how to contact or to reach us, whether mailing lists or RC channels.
Yeah. And one thing that might help is that I'm making the assumption you guys will move the mailing list from Red Hat list to Fedora hosted. But once you guys do that, and you guys have like a solid plan of how people can communicate with you guys, make a blog post on Fedora Magazine or the Fedora community blog or all the places. And that'll get that typically gets shared out on Twitter and all over the internets and stuff like that. And that tends to boost awareness all over the place for like, how do they interact with Pulp as a project? Because right now, I don't think anyone knows that you exist. To be blunt.
Hey, Neil,
you want everyone to know.
Have you used the Foreman or Catello community forums? What do you think of those versus a mailing list?
They suck. Like most of forum threads I post, so I've posted a couple of forum thread posts in there, and those threads tend to just die very quickly. So, and it's very hard to get anybody's specific attention in the forums. Now, the forums have an advantage of a lot more immediacy. People who are subscribed to certain categories will immediately get information about these and stuff like that. But the forums also have an interesting factor in that by default, people don't get everything. People only get what they're looking for. And that means that if you're filing into the right place, but there's nobody there, then it doesn't matter. You're screaming into a void. Mailing lists have the opposite problem in that it's basically a fire hose. But because most mailing lists are mostly low volume, it's not that big of a deal. Unless you have a mailing list that pushes commits to it, which is insane. And don't do that, please. For the love of everything that's good, don't. But generally speaking, the problem with forums is that people only see it if they're subscribed to it, if they're looking at that topic. They have to actively keep looking for it, and people don't do that. Just generally, they don't. So I think for Foreman, it worked out better for them because people were generally disengaged as a whole. And the way that most people consume Foreman was a little different from how most people would consume Pulp. Like, you also have to consider the different types of people that are going to be using this. And I'm not saying that not having a forum I'm not saying that having a forum would be a bad thing, or having a subforum or whatever, but I'm saying that I don't think it will solve your communication problem in particular. So
what other communication channels do you find yourself using when communicating with communities?
Matrix. If they have a forum, I sometimes use the forum. I honestly don't try very often. I prefer, most of the time I prefer real-time communication, so it's usually Matrix or IRC. But Matrix is actually increasingly popular for these kinds of things. And it's a lot more discoverable because of larger network of people. Also, having a good social media presence helps too. And right now you don't really have that. You have the Pulp Project Twitter handle, but like, I don't know what you do with it that much. I mean, I do see occasionally tweets about like, hey, you've done a demos and here's list of demos, but I don't know what you do with it besides that.
What do you recommend? So what do you recommend then for the social media? What kind of things do you expect to see there?
Well, what I expect to see there is, I think, somebody being active about talking about, hey, this is what we're doing, or interacting with people who tweet about it, like more interactive, and to be like a signal boost of the awareness of the project. Like, I look at the, Pulp Project, I think it's Pulp Proj, yep, I spelled it right on the first try, cool. So when I look at the Pulp Project Twitter thingy, like, I see no interactions with people at all. Like, I know people @tag the Pulp Project handle from time to time, but there are basically zero interactions from when that happens. So it looks a lot like an announce blaster rather than something where people are trying to genuinely engage. That's a chicken and egg problem. People don't engage because they don't feel like they can engage. It takes a little bit of work in figuring out what to do there. But like, just having the blog posts, having a Matrix channel, which is a lot more accessible than an IRC channel, and having your mailing list just be discoverable, those are small steps that'll make life a lot better. Because right now, you're actually a pretty hard project to find.
So what kind of interactions do you have in mind? Like, you're talking more about like open questions, like, hey, we did this and that. What do you think about this feature?
Yeah, those kinds of things. And then, people can retweet it for signal boosting, and then, it just kind of spreads out and people start talking about it more. I mean, it's not an easy thing to solve, but it is a thing that you can do. I think things that'll be a lot simpler to achieve are moving the mailing list to list.fedora hosted and making that more discoverable, and having a Matrix channel, moving some of your communications from IRC to Matrix, or at least bridging Matrix and IRC so people from Matrix can find you. Those will help.
Is Matrix free?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Matrix. You can get a free account on matrix.org. Okay. Yes.
And you can bridge it with other networks too.
Right. So, for example, some of the Fedora stuff is actually, they have Matrix rooms that are actually bridged into the Freenode IRC channels. And so it's basically bidirectional and native. So people show up with native mix on the IRC side, as on the Matrix side, they show up as Matrix IDs. So they're native in both directions. And OpenSUSE is rehoming all of their communications onto Matrix. So all of their IRC channels are now plumbed through Matrix. Matrix is the native panel, and Discord, Telegram, IRC, everything is just feeding in through Matrix. So that makes the communications more unified.
Sorry, I'll make one step back towards our mailing list. So you say that it's not really discoverable because it has the @redhat.com. That's the main
beef. The Red Hat mailing list index is not linked anywhere. You cannot find it.
Okay. That's good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, the only way I've ever found the Red Hat mailing list index is by going to an existing mailing list address and going to list info and then clicking on the list index. And that's
right.
how
That's how I do it every time.
Yeah. There is 0 links from the main redhat.com website anywhere at all to reach the mailing lists. So you cannot find it.
Yep.
Oh, and by the way, more than half of the mailing lists on the redhat.com mailing lists are dead.
Well, part of that is because we never throw anything away, because somebody might want to look up that mail and they didn't keep it in their folders.
Which is
I
fine.
did in
Which is fine.
2006,
But
Yeah.
it contributes to this is useless.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could that's a suggestion of like auto mark them as like no defunct, but my understanding is like the Red Hat way of coming up with the decision is create a mailing list for that decision making process.
Well,
that's why Red has so many internal mailing lists.
The internals, if you think the external ones that you were looking at, Neil, are bad, the external ones tend to be for a project, and it may move somewhere else, or we may just decide we're not going to do that or whatever. And those lists stick around and have been around since 2001.
Yep.
You know, half of our mailing lists can probably drink at this point.
Yeah.
Interesting. This is cool. This is great discussion. Oh goodness, it's 1:02:11.
Oh geez, I gotta get going.
Yeah, I just realized that myself. Is Brian, are you still there? Do I have time to go grab a cup of tea before we start the multi-tenancy discussion? I think Brian's getting his own cup of tea. All right, gang, I'm going to be right back. We have multi-tenancy starting in 1.5 minutes.
Brian, how many hats do you have?
A lot. I wonder if I can wear a different one for every session all week.
Oh, that's a real hat and not just like a Zoom hat or whatever.
Oh yes, all real hats.
That sounds like a challenge. Right.
Yeah, there are very many hats. It's kind of easy when your wife runs a circus company.
Well then.
Wow.
Yeah, there are many props. Let's never at the storage unit though. Ina, I see you have a fancy hat.
Oh yeah, I don't have a hat, but I decided to support you.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, it is 11:01, and I think I'm organizing, running.
So I'm gonna have to drop. I'll be back in an hour or so, but I've got my weekly planning meetings. Yeah.
Neil, I think this is our last session. I don't think we have anything else today.
Okay, well then, I guess I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Jenny.
you, Neil.
Bye.
So I'm gonna get the agenda up here. This is still live broadcasting through YouTube. YouTube is not recording this, but it is still going out there live. I had updated the agenda link to reflect the YouTube URL. And this is the chat link for this session, which is on multi-tenancy. And we will I'll also put this link into the YouTube chat here. That way the peeps out there can see. All right, and then with that, we can go ahead and click record, which I will do now, and this will be posted later. And here we go with the record. All right, welcome to the PulpCon session on multi-tenancy and some of the challenges that Pulp 3 has with multi-tenancy. There's an agenda here at the HackMD link related to the entry in the schedule, and what I was hoping to do is have a discussion, not really a presentation, but more of a roundtable discussion about kind of two problems that I'm concerned about. We've discussed this some in the past, but I thought this would be a good venue for us to kind of chat about it a little bit more. My goal is to have a lot of discussion. It's likely not something we'll be able to resolve here, but if we can all come away with a better understanding of the problem and brainstorm possible solutions and share with others, and maybe have an idea or two that we think might solve one or both of these problems, that would probably be the best case. This time we'll go to the 50 minutes after the hour, so we have about 45 minutes. My claim is that even with RBAC, and this is line 8 on the agenda, even with RBAC, Pulp is not multi-user safe in two specific ways. One of them is problem 1, and this is the more serious of the two problems. Content itself is not safe. So as you know, the kind of description of the problem is lines 12, 13, and 14. I'll kind of paraphrase it here, but if you have two users, Alice and Eve, Alice has secret content like putting GPG keys into an RPM that Alice is going to distribute to her systems using that RPM's installation. And Alice uploads that RPM to Pulp so Pulp can store it. And it has some Nevra, whatever that Nevra is that Alice has chosen, because Alice built it. Then Eve comes along and falsifies an RPM with the same Nevra and uploads it to Pulp, or creates a falsified repo that contains that RPM and syncs from that repo. Pulp, because it's a big deduplicating machine, is going to recognize that as already present. And it's going to hand over into a repository that Eve controls the RPM that Alice wanted to keep secret and protect, and contains Alice's sensitive credentials. So the theme here is content isn't safe. And I just want to...
Brian.
Yes.
In that case, wouldn't the falsified RPM have to have like the same checksum and size as Alice's RPM?
I'm seeing some heads nod yes and some nod no.
I think so.
So even in that case, though, now what's happened is I pushed a Nevra with a checksum and a size in order to prevent Alice from pushing hers, because mine already exists, even though we're two different people and our content shouldn't be shared.
You'd have to
push or the other, that problem is the same.
You'd have to push it to the same repo, though, which I think is maybe not the case that we're trying to cover here.
Well, no, not necessarily the same repo. To the same Pulp instance.
The same instance?
No, I can push two different RPMs with the same Nevra with different checksums to the same Pulp instance.
Oh, that's right. That's right. As long as, yes.
There may be other content types that this is a problem with, Brian. Absolutely, like, I don't know, Ansible collections or something. But I think the RPM use case maybe is not actually correct.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I don't know what type of a SHA those checksums use. Is it SHA-256?
Well,
the reason I ask is because if it's SHA-256, then I pretty much totally agree with you in terms of that being an attack vector. But if it's SHA-1, then that's easy to compromise. And I'm just unsure of it.
Some
but
old
there's
comp
the
might have it, SHA-1.
some older content, yeah. What I was also thinking about is our artifact storage, and I don't know, what do we match artifacts on? SHA-256?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the SHA-256.
Yeah, and if you're showing up with the exact same artifact, then Pulp isn't providing you anything you don't already know. So I feel pretty safe in that area. So I think
Let me hang in there. I think at the moment when you know the SHA of something, you can get the artifact. You can retrieve information that you're not supposed to know.
not if there's content protection enabled.
Okay.
You would have to.
I think another example would be when you upload an RPM, like Alice will upload an RPM, and then Bob will try to upload same RPM, and because Pulp tries to deduplicate, it will look that there is already such RPM available. So I think this is something similar to what Mihai was bringing up with the container blobs, like layers, that Bob will fake that he wants to upload RPM, but he actually doesn't have the bits, and Pulp will say, oh, I already have this RPM. I don't know if someone else can phrase it better.
I think that's exactly what
basically
Brian was describing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's effectively the concern.
Okay.
And Justin, your point's very well made, and I just want to double down on that. The concern is that if not in this specific example, there will be other content types, Ansible collections for sure, file content, because whatever is the uniqueness constraint on content can be falsified by anyone to artificially show up with what looks like that same content elsewhere. Oh wait, they don't actually have the binary data, and what Pulp does is it gives them the binary data. And so that's one of the concerns. This actually came in the form of several CVEs, so this is a little bit more than theoretical against Pulp 2. Those CVEs were addressed in various ways. That's kind of beyond the scope of this conversation, but that's trying to speak to how theoretical is this problem, and I would say it's more than theoretical. And it specifically comes into play when we have a multi-user Pulp system. So the second problem, because I want to try to discuss some of the solutions and hear what you all think. Second problem is object natural key uniqueness. So Alice creates a repo named CentOS 8. User Eve wants to create a repo named CentOS 8, but cannot because it's already taken as a natural key. And now there are hundreds or thousands of users, and the names get very strange very fast, which is not really a safety concern, but I claim that it's pretty annoying. I see someone wrote some things on line 25.
I added that. Actually, speaking as an ex-security guy, that is a security concern.
I see.
Because it means I can find out the names of all of Alice's repos by simply trying to create repos and noting which ones fail. And that's a side channel, and I can gather information. Like if Alice is dumb and names her repos with like people's names or department names or phone numbers or God only knows what, you're leaking somebody else's information to a random script. And I have actually worked on projects where that problem was a Sev1, oh my God, stop the presses, we have to stop doing that. So you can't, when we think about this, the multi-user thing is if Alice and Eve both work for the same company, and that happens, then Eve goes and yells at Alice and says, you took my name, and that is a problem, but it's the minor one. But if we're different companies, the fact that I can issue an API call and find out things that are already used by somebody not in my company is a security problem. And that's where I need to be able to say, I want to create one named CentOS, and it should come back and go, you are the only person in your org that wants to use that name. You get to have a repo with that name, even though there's 1,000 other CentOS 8s in the Pulp instance. I don't know that. That's the multi-tenant problem as opposed to the multi-user problem.
Yeah. So thank you for saying that. It's a concern. It's not one that I would lose sleep over, but it is definitely a problem. And so these issues kind of both go together because they speak to Pulp's not being a multi-tenant system, not being multi-tenant safe. And so this is kind of where my prepared content generally ends, and we can have a discussion about what we could or couldn't do about these. Just as little starters, I have looked into the Django community and I've looked into the Postgres community, and I've pasted here links to what they recommend for these types of situations. And the first is a Django solution which uses the sites framework. The idea here is that there is this concept called a site, and really in Django land it came from websites, whereas you would have content, you'd be running the same website's feature set on multiple web properties. So each web property would become its own site in the sites framework. And then if you have users on property A and users on property B, those users never mix, because when the request comes in, it knows, oh, I'm on web property A, and all the ORM calls from that point on, and in our case all the way back, all in the tasking systems, know, this is all for web property A. And the sites framework lets you query set chain on this extra piece of data, which Django provides, and allows you to kind of create and manage sites and associate one or more objects with the current site that is in use for that request. So that's the sites framework. Let's have some discussion about that. Has anyone used this before? What do y'all think about this?
Does this require having actually separate domain?
No.
Even if it's just subdomains?
No. It does not actually. It doesn't actually work with domains at all. You can set the site aspect in a variety of ways, one of which could be done as part of the inbound middleware.
So Brian, I'm looking at the document you've linked here, and the way this gets implemented looks to me like that you're at the model level. The models where you want to take advantage of this know which site they belong to. It's a field on each of the models.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it's because this is the way that old SAT did multi-org, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. This is just the way that it worked was that every object belonged to an org, which is also a company or a site in this context, and had a foreign key that told this particular row in the database belongs to this org. And so if I'm logged in, I have an org, and there's nothing in the app that lets me see anything that doesn't match my org.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, Grant. That's the paradigm. That's the architecture. And it's not unlike if we had just done the same thing, only DIY'd it and didn't use the Django built-in facilities. Every object is a member of exactly one site.
Yep.
Exactly.
So it's essentially namespacing?
It's namespacing. That's exactly what it is. It's namespacing.
Yeah. That you could even have multiple users in the same site. So we kind of separate the tenancy from the multi-user problem.
Exactly right. And RBAC is based on the users logged in. This would be based on the site. Is the way that we've done it before.
Yeah, exactly.
The combination way to decide on the site, and that would again be the user, right?
Yeah, you could use the sites framework differently. You could on one deployment it doesn't have to be the same for all deployments, but you could make every user a site. And this would provide user level isolation 100%. Or you could make everything exactly one site in the whole installation. This effectively disables the siteness. Or you could do subsets, some number of sites. You can imagine computer science department, social science department, accounting department, and each one of those being a site. And everywhere in between from a capabilities perspective.
Yep.
But one user can only be in one site.
That's where it gets interesting. I hope we don't do that, because that was an anti-pattern for old RHN, because it thought that, a site is the important thing. It's a company, and a user belongs to a company, and always belongs to that company. And there's a whole discussion to be had about what happens when a human being moves from one to another. Oh my God, that's great. I love it. Especially for these discussions, we all need helmets. There's a whole discussion to be had, Matthias, along the lines of trying to get your data model to recognize that human beings move from company to company. And are they allowed to carry the stuff that they made with them or not? And what happens when they don't get to? It's still in your company. Somebody gets to own that. There's a whole raft of problems involved in that. And as long as we don't blindly step into the minefield without recognizing it, I'm sure we can come up there. I mean, there's answers out there. It's just we have a lot of anti-pattern experience of how to do it. I'd rather avoid those if we can.
Right. And even when they're not switching companies, they're still switching teams and divisions within the same company. That happens. They basically want to keep the count, but
and if you cite by organization, then that gets interesting.
Right.
We have solved this problem by having two kinds of sites that were companies where there was an admin that got to create sub-users, and sites that were just the user. So I would have my own personal site, and I couldn't create sub-users, and I owned all the stuff. But as Brian points out, you can build all of that on the kind of framework that we're talking about here, right? At that point, it's a question of how do you implement the sites and control access to them once you have the site field in every model. There's a lot of things you can do, is what I'm hearing.
And I will add, I've seen this multiple times. Users say, "Oh, I want multi-tenancy. I need it," and you give it to them, and they say, "Oh, this is awesome. This is amazing. Now I want to share things." Between my sites, which is, you're like, "Oh, I just did all this work to make it multi-tenant. Now you want to break down the walls," and that's not necessarily something you have to solve, immediately. But I would just say expect that request.
Yes.
Yeah.
And be prepared to answer it with no.
I think we should have at least one solution to the problem. That is, you install one instance for every tenant.
Which is that's today's solution right now. Is multi-tenancy is you're on a separate machine with a separate instance of Pulp and its own database.
Right, and that's 100% separation.
Yes.
Yeah, those are air-gapped systems, and I think that the big downside to that is, well, you have to manage and set up a bunch of things. You have to upgrade a bunch of things independently, and just calling these out because there's realities. It's not a terrible situation actually, but probably the biggest downside of what we would do today, air-gapped independent installations, is the much duplication of artifact file system storage. That's a big one. So like if you tried to run Rui this way, or some other large user this way, you would be duplicate for every extra entity that you want to provide isolation for. You now have to duplicate your entire file system, and that's the main thing to try to avoid.
Yeah, I was going to ask if artifacts would also be multi-tenant or would be shared. I think because some of the cases that you're talking about, where if I'm an attacker, and let's say I do know the checksum of that secret RPM, is that a use case we're trying to protect against? Because I could imagine if I can create a repo upstream that doesn't actually have the RPM, and then sync it with on demand and cause Pulp to think, oh, hey, I already know about this RPM, so I'm just going to associate the existing one.
No, I think what it would do in that case, or what I hope that it would do in that case, thank you for calling out the example. What I hope it would do is when it looks into Pulp during the sync, it will see, oh, this site, this user, member of this site, has no content. And even though Pulp has a bunch of content in it, the isolation provided is telling the database queries or responding and saying, oh, no, there is no content here. But then the sync will fetch, assuming that the artifact is real, then they will fetch that artifact, and they will then try to place it into the content addressable file system backend of Pulp. And since they are SHA-256 the same, they are the same, and Pulp will be able to provide deduplication at that point. And from that moment on, the user's like, oh, I got what I needed. And the beta administrator's like, cool, everyone thinks they got more, but actually we didn't pay any more in storage. So the administrator's like, cool, I got what I needed.
And there's no security exposure there in that scenario, because for the attacker, for Eve to be able to make that happen, they had to have had access to a repo that has the RPM with the checksum in it, and they could have just skipped Pulp and just downloaded it directly by doing a DNF install. So they're not, the Pulp instance isn't exposing anything at that point, is it?
That's my understanding.
It's okay, and I'm trying to think like the bad guys, and it's been a long time since I've done that. There's a Pulp instance. The Pulp instance is allowed access to that repo, but I am not, because I don't have the SAT certificate, for example. But I am allowed to create stuff in that Pulp instance. So I tell Pulp, hey, I want to have a repo named this. And Pulp says, okay. And I say, hey, I want you to use this as the remote. And Pulp says, I know how to find that remote. And I don't think that works, because I think already at that point, you have to have, once RBAC is in place, you have to have access to the keys to the repo that you're telling Pulp you want to sync for you. I think the user does, or at least can be made for that to happen. I think there's definitely discussion about this, but I think between RBAC and the discussion about site, the tools are there to close the security holes that I'm groping for here.
What I heard is that you can fake an upstream repository that's supposed to contain certain SHA checksums,
right,
and not the actual files, and then you do a sync
On
from
demand.
there, and Pulp says, oh no, I know this artifact, I don't need to download it again.
No.
Yeah, the idea is that it would
That level,
download it again.
A list to say this user has access to this artifact in the database.
Because it's on demand. I don't actually look for the file.
Let me
say something real quick, right? I think the difference you made is artifacts are different than artifact storage. And so artifacts are not shared. Artifact storage is shared.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that might actually be a solution if we kind of separate the artifact storage from Pulp and make it shareable between Pulp instances. Then the multi-tenancy can again be several Pulp instances sharing one artifact storage.
Yeah, and that's a possible option too, but we are then left with a lingering set of problems that I think are not as great in terms of user experience outcomes. Like, for example, you'll have to manage multiple independent isolated deployments. You'll have to upgrade each one independently. You'll have to configure all of them independently. And that's kind of the beauty of actually of baking in this sites framework directly into Pulp itself.
Yeah, if I put my hat on, Matthias, as the admin of, I will take the horrific at the end of the spectrum example, rack space. and they have thousands of customers, all of whom want rel, let's say. And they want to have a couple of admins that go to one control panel and configure, somebody I call in and say, here's my credit card, give me an account, and now I want to have rel access. They want to be able to set all that up from one place, as opposed to having to spin up a whole new instance for me. It's all in one spot. And when somebody calls in and says it's broken, they don't have to figure out which interface am I going to look at. I'm going to look at the global interface and say, for this site, what's the problem, as opposed to having to find the specific machine that has a problem. So if you put on the helmet of I am providing a service to a lot of people that are giving me money, none of whom are allowed to know about the other people that are giving me money. There's a whole bunch of use cases that fall out of that. And the site stuff is necessary for it. I think the lockless work is necessary for it, because at that point you're talking about a level of scale in one instance that is going to get exciting. So we need both of those, but I think they're incredibly powerful, and they match. Dennis, you're killing me here. They match real world use cases, and I need to shut up now because that's just too damn funny.
It's the only hat that's not packed.
You look stunning. I just got to say, it's you.
Yeah, so with the sites thing, I believe that it's the Django built-in way to provide isolation. I think that the problem statements up at the top are pretty motivating in terms of the need for isolation. And so I believe this is on the viable list. And when and who, I think, is not something I'm necessarily trying to put a timeline to right now. But whenever this does become the most important next step, I think a prototype would be the way. Basically, enable the sites framework and take our objects and the stages API also, and have them have the sites object set at incoming call request time, have the sites object preserved through to task runtime, and have the query sets return data appropriately.
Limited by site, yeah.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of possibilities here.
One question I had is, for true multi-tenancy, distribution paths could conflict, which would mean that maybe they would have to exist at different paths. Like, meaning all of my distributions would be prefixed with site name or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the direction y'all are thinking?
I mean, that's definitely an option. And we could have, that's definitely an option. And we could actually have maybe even RBAC help provide the at call request time verification around the creation and modification of the distribution URLs to basically cause all the URL layouts to adhere to the idea that you had just shared, which is that their site ID is contained in the all distribution URLs are namespaced by site ID, and you can do whatever you want for your site within your site's ID's distribution URL namespace, but not others. We could also do it in the middleware, just generally as well. But from an ideas regardless of how it's done, from an ideas perspective, I think that's very legit. The other option is to actually use different independent web properties and have them be run as one big Pulp deployment with one database. So it's really one installation still, but have each site be a server block that has a different name. And so it would be like pulp or csc.pulp.example.com and literature.pulp pulp.example.com, and then when the Nginx routes those things in, it's passing the site ID that needs to be set along with each one. And in that case, you don't need to provide any special distribution URL namespacing. We may need to revise our conflicting checking code a little bit, but you're avoiding the problem because the host name would be server name multiplexed. That's another fine example option too.
And then you go to different content directories at the Nginx level, for example. It would say ggainy.pulp.com goes to, I don't know, var www/ggainy/whatever. That's not visible from the URL. I can make my URLs whatever I want, but the engine is deciding what content to deliver at that point.
Yeah.
I don't think I said that right, but you.
Well, it would pass.
With that?
Well, in effect, I mean, yeah, it would pass. I think the idea is it would pass the site ID back to the backend, and the backend can take it from there. And the trick
do the right
is,
thing at that point.
Yeah, exactly, and do the right thing. So it's not as tied to the file system as perhaps your example is, but that's an idea.
Okay.
I also want to try to talk a little bit about the Postgres option, which is basically the same thing, only with a different mechanism. But before we go on, are there other thoughts or ideas or concerns along with this type of a thing? All right, well,
the only thought I have is, Matthias, I think you're muted. I don't know if you were trying to speak, but we are doing namespace. We're adding namespacing to the container plugin already. And the exact thing that Justin brought up with the relative paths, we're already hitting, where basically that namespace is now going to be, even though we're going to have a namespace object that's going to be, a foreign key to other things, we're still having to update the base path of the distributions to contain that namespace in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that content served by the content app is namespaced in the URL. And so we're, whenever we introduce this feature that we're discussing now, we will need to address it right away, how the content app is going to handle the namespacing.
I agree.
Yeah, that's a good point with containers, because like satellite contains namespacing or multi-tenancy already, or Catello. But a single registry URL or a single registry doesn't support that. So users are expected to write their Docker files pointing to, slash my base image, because that works against Docker Hub. And then they want to sync down that repo and use the same Docker file against the registry that Pulp is hosting. And that doesn't work with multi-tenancy very well. Yeah.
I don't think I've actually understood what you said.
Yeah, so the common problem in Satellite today, or Catello today, is I have my Docker file, and its base layer is some great app, right? If I sync down some great app from Docker Hub, I can have one instance of some great app, and I can Docker pull from the Pulp registry at some great app. I can Docker build against some great app, but as soon as I need another instance of some great app, it is now a different repo path. So it's now some great path 2, and now I have to update my Docker files to account for that. And in Catello, it's not just at the org level; it's also at the lifecycle environment level that this problem exists. So I have to update my Docker files for multi-tenancy or for multi-lifecycle environments. And if you used domain names or subdomains to handle this, I think it would work perfectly. It's just that puts kind of the onus on the user to have multiple subdomains in their installation. I think it's a great solution. It's just maybe not a great solution that everybody can use.
So Justin, the other side of that is that somehow I have a Docker file that says I get my thing from registry/the container. And that works when I'm in dev. And what I really want is for that exact same URL to work when I'm in the QA workflow that you've just described. But magic happens and somehow I'm now getting a different container than the one that was named that in the dev environment.
Yeah.
Basically, the way the Docker clients work is that you can reuse the names, but tell it to use a different host name. And this is why Justin is saying that using host names to do the
citing
separation is for the Docker case, would work a lot better
than have it in the URL. And that was one of the things that that I was kind of groping for with the do we solve this at the Nginx level, which is you would change your host name. The app, it's still my container, but the host that you're using to get it from Pulp is dev001.mine.pulp.whatever, and then it's QA 001.mine.whatever to get and that'll get you a different one because it would be happening. They would be essentially virtual hosts in the Pulp instance, in the single Pulp instance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It sounds like virtual hosts would make this a lot easier than namespacing URLs.
I mean, we still have to have the underlying site stuff that we've talked about here. That still has to be in place. It's a question of there's a few specific areas where we might want to make it possible for a user to get things without them having to explicitly put in their site. Because the engine knows, we would know, Pulp would know, oh, your site X. Making the user put that X into their URLs feels wrong because the user's like, why do you keep asking me for this? You already know it. Why are you making me put it in here? Right. And it feels like there are ways to make that happen magically and usefully to the user while preserving the site, the multi-tenancy in a useful way. I feel like there's a gap between where I'm standing and what I can almost see in the mist somewhere over there.
No, I feel like that would work.
Yeah, so content guards provide some of this, right? Wow, it's a lion.
It really is a lion.
Right now, for RPM content, it has the path in it, and it's still the user providing that path.
Right.
And I could see situations where that certificate wouldn't necessarily have a path encoded in it. The system would just know that this certificate belongs to these paths.
Right. CertGuard is definitely a place where we'd have to think about what the exposed experience was. Okay.
Yep. So,
but again, go ahead.
So part of so it sounds like after discussion we've had some things that we should be thinking about, definitely, particularly how we expose or don't expose this namespace value in attributes or in URLs. But and I'm also perceiving that it would be there's no disagreement about it being a useful needed feature for Pulp, not with any claim about when exactly. And so we can make a proposal some other day in terms of like an actual plan, and probably maybe a little special interest group or something like that to try to put a actual proposal together and perhaps produce some sort of short prototype. If we had come here and it was like, oh, there's this hard problem and this hard problem and what you don't know is about this hard problem, then we would not have a next step like that. We would have a next step that was basically like, we're screwed. So I'm satisfied with that. I mean, like, that's about as much as I was hoping to discuss to share the problem and then kind of set the table for what are our possible solutions and look down the road a little bit for some possible gotchas. And we have a few of those as well. So that's good.
And on which release do you foresee these changes to be applied?
I don't actually have a specific one. To me, the question is just adjust it a little bit. What work is more important than this work? And I think our backing all the things is more important. I think the migration plugin and getting the Pulp 2 to Pulp 3 user base just generally upgraded is more important. And I see the CLI as likely more important as well. I can't think of many other things.
I mean, right now, if somebody said to me, Grant, how does Pulp handle multi-tenant without making me duplicate everything on disk, my answer would be you have multiple Pulp instances that share a file system where all the artifacts go, which is basically how Rui, for example, does things. It's suboptimal, and from an administrator, they're upset when they're like, well, what if I want thousands of users? And my answer is then you're going to have to wait for another instance of Pulp to come around. But right now, we could solve this problem grossly with a gigantic sledgehammer of Matthias's thing about multi-instance is multi-tenant, largely.
Yep.
So we have an answer. It's just nobody's happy with, but it'll work. So I don't feel like this is a stop the presses level problem.
I agree.
If we had zero answer, then we would have to talk, because this is a real world use case. But it does need to be something we talk about and solve. Maybe not till Pulp 4, but it needs to be solved, because this is really useful to people that want to use Pulp at scale. This is a very useful concept.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about a very large deployment using Pulp, like if a site that had as large a user base as like Docker or Artifactory, for example, were to be using a technology like Pulp, I think this would be an absolute must. And so that's a goal to grow into, but one that I think is consistent with our other goals of growing the user base significantly. So we'll talk more about that at community sessions as well. I just want to call out line 35. I don't think we are going to go through it very much here, but if you're interested, you can check it out. It's basically just like the sites framework, only instead of having database, letting the Django ORM configure and figure out what objects a particular user who's a member of a site should be able to see. It does it actually at the row level itself in the database. It has been around for a while. This is not a new feature of Postgres. It is a very well-known feature of Postgres, and it is one that we could use. And that actually looks to me pretty awesome. But from a high level, it's the same.
It requires a different database user for every site, essentially, right?
Yeah.
I think it requires a context. Does it?
It looks like, I mean, I'm just looking at the document for 8 seconds. It looks like user, but.
Yep.
And so you have a dynamic Django config.
You connect to it with your default, and then you switch the user to that user.
I got you. Yep.
And that's pretty great, because literally you can just move it all into the database. Like, who's handling all this? Postgres is handling all this.
Well, and the other nice thing is it means that you don't have to worry about, for example, you've got a hole in your ORM somewhere where you forgot to check for site.
Exactly.
The database doesn't let you forget. Again, the ex-security guy in me is much happier with you just can't get there from here if we can make that happen. Interesting.
Yeah. And so implementation-wise,
never forgets.
Yeah, I'm more interested in the RLS option. but conceptually speaking, they're about the same. So we have about 3 minutes, and so I guess last calls for thoughts and comments, concerns.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Tanya, it's hard. The rushing wind going by your head is making it hard to hear you.
I know. I wanted to ask Brian if it makes sense to maybe start a thread or send email to mailing list if people have other ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and one that I would like to do. I don't know when, but one that I would like to do. And that would look more like these first 2 problem statements, only with a proposal underneath it, like a concrete one. Like here's how we'll handle this problem that we talked about here, and here's how we'll use row level security. Here's where it'll be set here and there,
and everywhere.
A loose plan for us to redo together.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for the discussion. And I'm going to click the stop button now, if that's all right with you all. All right, the recording has stopped. The YouTube is still live. I think I'm going to probably stop the YouTube here, as I believe we're adjourning.
Yep.
For the day.
Yeah, I need to have time to go find some hats to wear for tomorrow.
Yeah, bring your hats for tomorrow.
I'm gonna definitely unpack my hat box.
Yeah.
You know, we've got to. So 2020 PulpCon got called HatCon. I love the hats. I'm just saying, I love the hats.
Yeah, bring your hats.
Sorry, I have a quick organizational question. Does it make sense to keep track of action items somewhere? Like we discussed that we need to, I don't know, dig more into Django migrations to figure out the major branching, and we need to have discussion here and there. There were suggestions from Neil about how to improve our communication channels. Since it's the first day and we still have those things in mind. The question is, does it make sense to write all the action items down somewhere?
I think it does.
Tanya, do we want to just add them to the notes page that I put together? Just right at the top, put an action items thing, and then just copy them in there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I want this all to be in a single document.
That's what I was thinking. Is that this is kind of I'm thinking this in my head is kind of a parking lot or not about events, and that just seems like a good place to put that. So if we just throw, in fact, I'm sitting here looking at it, and I'll do that right now.
I think we can dump all the notes for now into this document and then extract action items by the end of PulpCon.
Sure. Okay.
I would put them, to be honest, I would put them right away. The person who leads the session probably is more aware of topic and they can do it right now, but I don't know.
And where's this link? That sounds fine. Where's this link?
I just created this. I added it into the schedule document as well. It's at the top. There's a link to it. It's called Pulp 2020_random notes. Where I was just trying to capture some of the stuff that wasn't about the events that we were in. So the first action item is
up at 1, 2.
The first action item is anybody who presented today has to put their action items into this document.
The thing is, the action item is useless unless it has a specific name attached to it.
Exactly right. Then it's not an action item, it's just a suggestion.
And the action item shouldn't be necessarily tied to the person who is actually leading the session.
Well, that's fine. In my case, I'll take mine just because I feel attached to that.
I think the person who leads this session at least can have an action item to find the person who will take care of that action item. If it makes sense.
I mean, let's be fair, we're making this up as we go along, so I'm sure it's going to be a little suboptimal for a bit, but I'm with Dennis on let's try and get all this stuff in one place so we can look at it as part of the retrospective and start going over them. Okay.
So wasn't there an action item about the Django migration stuff?
Yep. We need to figure out how to cherry pick migrations, basically, which is a discussion we already started. And it's not just relevant really for the 4.0 to 3.0. I think it's relevant now with having so many stakeholders who will want to have older releases.
Yep.
So we had this discussion, I think, on OpenFloor, right?
Yep, and I was going to send out an email to continue the discussion. And so I can take this action item. Let's see. Yep. I will take an action item to continue
Cool. Self-organizing action lists. I love it.
Do any of you use Matrix? Like I started using it recently. Do any of you use that?
I use it.
I use it as well, but I suffer all the time.
What do you mean, Tanya?
Well, I use it on my phone, and I mean, it's really nice and good, and it's open source, and it's very secure, and all those things. But it's not very user friendly, in my opinion. Like, if you want to encrypt all your communication, it's such a pain. I don't know. Then sometimes it's down. Like the whole matrix.org, but you can have your own server, matrix server, if you want to. Yeah, which I don't know. Probably it's for enthusiasts.
If you have your own, do they connect to a network, to a common one? Or do you then have your own chat rooms?
When you have your own, it bridges with other networks, just like just like the one hosted at matrix.org bridges with other networks as well. You can bridge with matrix.org or other independently hosted ones. Mm-hmm. Think of it like chat, if chat ran like Git runs.
Yep. I mean, that's Matrix's sub-bullet. It's a decentralized chat server, just like Git is a decentralized repository server.
Yeah, and you're basically just setting up links around when refs are exchanged automatically.
Yep. I mean, people have been trying to get Red Hat to switch to running a large Matrix server and moving all of our internal comms to that as well, with mixed success. I suspect because of Tanya's observation, which is getting it set up is kind of non-trivial, running it is non-trivial, and there's no one who's assigned to make that happen, because that would require an actual team of people that get paid to do that. So I know there's a lot of people, Mel, at Red Hat that use Matrix in one context or another. I haven't yet, but if this might just be the tipping point for me. So I'll climb on the bus and we can share horror stories.
I'm trying to process feedback from Neil. What do we do with this suggestion about mailing lists? I believe it will deserve a separate discussion.
If you have a Fedora mailing list, would you have to have some involvement with the Fedora community to some extent, which I don't think we do at the moment? That would be my only. And like, if you Google Pulp mailing list on any Google or DuckDuckGo or anything, it comes up straight away. I don't know. I don't know how big a problem it is. Communicating with us is obviously a problem, for sure.
Yeah.
But is moving to a mailing list hosted on a platform that we don't necessarily serve an answer? I don't know.
Well, I think there's a chicken and egg thing. Is Neil would like to see Pulp in Fedora, and moving the mailing list to Fedora is a way to spur that discussion. So there's a chicken and egg problem there. I'm not a huge fan of moving mailing lists just because it's the XKCD thing of you end up now we have two mailing lists that we have to pay attention to because human beings don't update their mail servers. And losing history and all that jazz. So I'm not completely sold on it, but I definitely want to take on board his comments and do some investigation there.
I mean, I think, so he mentioned the benefit of being on fedorapeople.org rather than redhat.com is that you can browse all the mailing lists on that platform, which I don't think is going to help us tremendously. I think if we could achieve more bang for a buck by just better listing Pulp list and Pulp dev on our website.
Well, they're there.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I have the same sentiment.
I don't disagree. I'm trying to put on a different hat. We're used to being I have the word Pulp in my head, and I'm going to go Google search on Pulp. And I think Neil comes from I'm a Fedora person, and I'm using all my Fedora things. And what's this Pulp thing that shows up occasionally in my Fedora data streams? So it's a different user looking in than someone who already knows Pulp and is trying to find the mailing list from what is this thing? I need that thing. How am I going to know about that thing? If I never occurred to me to Google Pulp mailing list because I've never heard of Pulp before. How do I discover it? Is I think Neil's thing. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that it's 180 degrees on the other side of looking to find the mailing list. It's a different kind of user.
Yeah. It's a user that doesn't even know that they are looking for us.
Exactly right.
Grant, in the real life, if I'm going to have 10 things popping up every day, which I never heard about, it's not like I'll be super encouraged and motivated to open each of them.
Sure. I mean, and if honestly, for all of us, I think if it's only 10 things a day, you're doing well.
Yeah, I think Neil's input is really valuable. I think it's one perspective, a heavily involved Fedora user.
Sure. I mean, and if honestly so I think for all of us, I think if it's only 10 things,
I think I would definitely talk with other users. If other users have problems, I think Neil's mailing lists that aren't as heavily involved in Fedora, then maybe it's worth exploring that option or other option.
Yeah.
So where do you talk to those people if they're not reading our mailing lists?
Go ahead.
Not to be defensive or anything, but I did have a look through while he was speaking. I did have a look through our Twitter mentions, and other than there was a Justin's blog on Fedora back in on OS3 content and the move from Pulp 2 to Pulp 3. That was the last time someone interacted with us, and that person got a reply both on Twitter and on the forum and discourse as well. And Neil was on that thread as well. So it's not like we're being bombarded with questions on Twitter I'm monitoring that quite closely. I
don't think that's what he was saying, actually. What he was saying is that we should solicit input from people. I think that's what he was saying. It's not. He wasn't saying that we're not responsive to users.
He did say something about. Well, I can look back, but he did say something about mentions not being valid. That's what I felt.
From what I understood, his suggestion was to have more open questions. Something like, we introduced this sort of feature. What do you think about this? Where would you use it? How it fits into your current workflow or installation, etc., etc. And I don't know, tagging specific people. Yeah, he mentioned that. However, I have no idea whom we tag.
So
I think his thought process kind of was evolving. He did mention those things, Melanie, and he also mentioned those things. I think he kind of evolved into maybe like ask more questions and be more interactive that way towards the end.
So I think, and to be fair to Neil, part of the reason why we're doing PulpCon is exactly these emergent discussions, because that would never have occurred to me. None of this stuff, even if we decide not to move the mailing list, getting the feedback that there's a problem here is absolutely valuable input, and I love it to death. The other specific thing I want to say is, Mel, we all realize you've only been charged with dealing with this stuff for like 6 months, and you have years of none of us thinking in terms of, the outreach and the usability and the social media stuff that you're doing as our full-time gig. So nobody here is like, Mel, how come you're not making Twitter more useful right this instant? I mean, we all love you to death for what you're doing. Please keep doing it.
Oh no, but I have no problem with just say something not working. But it was just that it was probably an evolution of, as Justin was saying, of his thought process, and I kind of fact checked one part of it. I suppose that's all. I was like #just saying that rather than thinking this was some kind of massive failing so far. But no, it's a very the name Pulp doesn't help us, I think.
Definitely, the paper industry really competes with us a lot.
So does Pulp Fiction
and the band.
Oh God, the band.
So
and the fiction
was talking about so many pulps. I was talking with a friend of mine who works at a Duke crazy sciencey hard science kind of lab, and he was talking about some of his lack of Twitter interactions, and it reminds me of this conversation. He's like, what can I do to get the word out about the great work that we're doing at our lab? And I'm like, well, you can do all these things. And he's like, yeah, that's great, but when we actually sit down and look at what he's doing, he's building these sensors, which maybe there are only 2 or 3 of them in the world. And it does, it has to do with superconducting circular coils that study helium at extremely low temperatures. And yet he's trying to take that topic and turn it into like everybody's going to engage real hard on this kind of topic. So, I mean, maybe get Neil deGrasse Tyson on the case, but it's extremely difficult to take something like what he's talking about, and I'll bring it back to Pulp. It's extremely difficult to take something like Pulp, which is business software used by large deployments and very few numbers of those deployments, if you think about it, and turn it into Ceph or Fedora, or pick something that has a very, very large, broad, many installations user base. And so the way to do that I don't think is as much in a name change or a mailing list hosting change per se. I think the way to do that is to make Pulp usable with a UI, and make Pulp not a esoteric API based software, but actually make it a ready to run out of the box, support all your content types, and just click. Because if we can't capture users who are easier and have less time for us, then I don't think we can be exciting. I don't care how it's presented to them. It's not going to be like it's not going to be like that.
I agree. And Brian, that's part of what drove my question for Neil, which was, we don't have a UI, we don't have a CLI. Is there any particular point to trying to make this more accessible to Fedora? Because Pulp is hard to use if you're not used to using the REST API and you're not already writing to it. It's difficult to use. And I think his comment was was valid, right? If we make it available in Fedora, the folk that already know about it will find ways to use it, and we might get more feedback to start that way. But again, it's a chicken and egg thing. If we had a sexy UI right now, then we could put a website in front of it and say, here, go interact with a live version of Pulp. Ready, go. Oh, how cool is that? We're not there yet, but I think that your thrust there is absolutely on the mark. If not just, so, you said Fedora. Yes, there's a ton of people in our industry that use Fedora, but the people I interact with every day every time I say Fedora, they look at me and go, I thought you wore cowboy hats, because that's their only context. They have no idea what I'm talking about. And Pulp is a niche of a niche of a niche. Well, I'm going to look for one. I'm going to look for one. So you're only going to get a niche number of people who ever would want to use it. But we definitely want to get more feedback from that community, even if it's only a couple of hundred people. I mean, I'm looking at the Pulp project on Twitter right now. There's 384 followers. Who the hell are these people?
Yeah, I agree.
mean, admittedly, half of them are bots, but still.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we have different customer types right now. We have like the sysadmins and SRBs that just want to use something to manage servers, and we have like the developers that want it in their pipeline.
Yep.
What makes me really
but the number of sites being like, either organizations or an organization so large as multiple sites that are interested in us is in the thousands, tens of thousands.
Yep.
Yeah, what really makes me sad is that people at Red Hat are using like Nexus and Artifactory, and they don't even know about Pulp. That's really upsetting.
Exactly.
Or some of those people, to be fair, know about Pulp, but they only know about Pulp 1.0, and that's why they're not using Pulp.
Yeah.
Because they tried to use it, God, how long now? 12 years ago, and they had a really bad experience. So
what I'd like to do, since we are over time and I have to go because I have to have another meeting, although you all can continue, is we have a session, I believe, tomorrow in the morning, which is, if I can get the agenda up correctly, building community. Oh, look, it's supposed to be led by me, and that might surprise you because I'm not the community manager. But Melanie's talk, this is kind of just being split into two parts. Melanie's session is going to be on Wednesday. And so the theme here, Melanie and I have been kind of collaborating on this, so help me make sure this is accurate, Melanie. The theme with splitting this up into two sessions is tomorrow, let's brainstorm together about what we want to do to build the Pulp project's community to accomplish all of these goals that we're talking about, excuse me. Mm-hmm. And then on Wednesday, let's actually make a list about how we're going to do it. And so I think that actually if we pause now and resume to tomorrow morning's session, we're going to find ourselves in effectively the same conversation.
Yeah.
Cool. And this is a really important conversation to be had.
Yeah, so bring your cowboy hats.
Yes.
This is all I have. I think I might get fired if I go
No, that's perfect.
No, I love it. That is absolutely Red Hat.
Make sure to put it on whenever you say something controversial.
Yeah.
Can we make sunglasses?
My name.
Oh, man.
All right, well, thanks
for... What was that, Artemis?
Can we make it sunglasses day tomorrow?
Oh, man, I got a wall of sunglasses. We can do some sunglasses. No problem.
I lost my glasses last week. I had to work with my bloody sunglasses on for about 2 hours until I took them off put them in some intelligent place, and then I was home alone, so going around like a lunatic. So that was I already had a sunglass day. But I was content.
All right, cool beans, gang.
All right, see you guys.
Awesome.
Well,
everybody online.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.